The whole question of the budget, as it's probably one of the most important tools that government has to bridge the gap between what the promises are, the liberation promise, and what it is able to affect in delivery, has to be considered in the context of what's happening in our country. Now, the key indicators for us in Labour is what is probably stated by the President in his State of the Nation address. What is the triple challenge in South Africa? Unemployment has risen from around 18% in 1994 to close on to 35% now. The levels of poverty in respect of aggregate income into poorer households is less now than it was in 1994. It's certainly less of the percentage of the annual income in South Africa is going to the bottom 60% of the society. But then the worst indicator of the fact that our country is moving in the wrong direction is the fact that inequalities in our society is growing. If inequalities was a feature of the worst outcomes of apartheid, how is it that it could get worse after apartheid with the budgets that's meant to address that? So that must raise issues for us in respect of how the budget has been applied as government's most important tool to start intervening in respect of what the challenges are that confronts the country. And it's in that respect that we look at the budget in the context of the overall policy mix that government's put in place. We think that with the introduction of GEAR in 1996, we saw a move away from the reconstruction and development program, shifting away from, I suppose, what was the key tenets of the Freedom Charter into a more conservative stance. And at the time, the government's reasons for that was that there was a run on the currency and we needed to attract foreign direct investment, and so we needed to send a signal to the markets to make sure that they bring about the capital that was required in the economy. But along with how the budget was used, along with that, there were clear indications of what the tax to GDP ratio was. So that was specified in the GEAR policy. I think it was 25%. But there were a number of other measures also specified in the GEAR policy that had a detrimental effect on the environment and the circumstances of workers. One of that was that there were significant tax cuts that came around at the time. So even though we had a greatest portion of the population to take care of, the government actually had less money available to do that because of the tax cuts in the main to the wealthy. We reduced tariffs, the taxes on imports, and this led to a huge amounts of cheaper imports that took away the industrial capacity and jobs of many workers, most notably in the clothing sector in the Western Cape, but certainly many other areas of the industrial economy around the country. There were labor market regulations that saw a great move towards outsourcing and labor broking, which essentially meant that workers moved from good, fairly decent paid workers with pension and medical aid to jobs in outsourced or labor broking companies that had none of those benefits and where they earned a fraction of what they earned before. So the net effect of all of this was that you actually reduced the consumer base, the amount of disposable income that was available to ensure that it in itself drove economic demand and economic development was taken away. But a lot of the worst practices of apartheid was left in place. And so monopolies within the society continued their collusive practices. And we've seen that across the board, whether it's steel prices, bread prices, chicken prices, or the construction of the stadium for the World Cup. In all of those areas, we've seen the difficulties with that. And then there was also the big push for privatization in respect of ISCO, which should have been a key contributor to economic development, especially in the manufacturing sector, for automotive and other industries, but also in areas like transport, water, refuse removals, and some of the municipal services that are provided. So that's features of the economic decisions that government took that was given effect to by the budget had led to the circumstances that we had 20 years later in South Africa. So even though GDP doubled from 2 trillion rand to 4 trillion rand in 2014, the poorer section of the society had got poorer. And a lot of that GDP growth was driven by consumption. But it was consumption mainly being driven by the new emerging middle class, the black middle class and the white middle classes, who essentially spend their money on very extravagant imported goods that didn't contribute to creating more employment opportunities, the expansion of the industrial base, or the growth of the economy that could have a knock-on effect into other areas. What did all of this do to the society? For us, what that meant is that the policy mix in South Africa clearly was not reinforcing what the policy objectives were stated in 1994 and certainly what the promises were in the Freedom Charter. The consequence of that policies and the difficulties that working people are confronted with is that you see now growing levels of protest across the country on a variety of issues, just because the circumstances of working people and the unemployed are just so difficult that they can't respond to raising their voices in any other way. We see crime and the dysfunctionality of the society getting worse, with many areas of communities being governed and controlled by gangsters. This is, of course, led by the corruption that's often the poster child is the #1 citizen in the country of demonstrating that it's not to be dealt with the kind of urgency that we have. So all of these things mean that we're sitting on a time bomb in South Africa, that poor people can't continue with the desperate circumstances that they have. And the budgets have not responded to their circumstances in the last 20 years. What it may have signaled is pretty much business as usual as it was under apartheid, with slight adjustments in different areas, but the overall framework largely remaining the same. So if we are to address that, if we are to have a country after the next 5 years, we've got to do things radically different, because more of the same will not address the social discontent that's growing in the country, because you have an unemployment level of 35% and probably 60-odd% of young people under the ages of 30 is unemployed and will not have job prospects in the next 5 years. And so that is going to lead to the growing discontent that we have. There's clearly a need for a new deal in the society. That new deal must be informed by some kind of consensus. The 1994 consensus meant that we said that we would not have a vengeful state that tried to undo the legacy of apartheid and the great injustice of the grand theft that came about as a consequence of that. But we'd find a way to balance people's interest and use the democratic institutions that we built to ensure that we respond to the legacies and the effect of apartheid. But we haven't done that. We haven't used the main tool that we have to give effect to that. And that's why today, when we look at the economy is largely untransformed. The majority of people who own shares on the JSE in respect of private capital still resides in white hands. There still is a huge distortion. And so now you have the notion of black economic empowerment and radical economic transformation being misused in some quarters to mean the empowerment of a few connected. But it's because we haven't done that in a systemic way that ensured we were able to fundamentally change the ownership patterns in our country and deal with the circumstances. So if there is to be a new deal now, if we are to find a new way of dealing with the challenges that exist in our society, we've got to rebuild the trust that existed in 1994, when people were prepared to engage, when they thought there was going to be the quid pro quo, sense of magnanimity from the side of both of those who were the erstwhile conflictors in the days of apartheid. But none of that came about. Of course, the economy carried on really well, and all that you had is the new black elite becoming ensconced amongst the white elite, and the ownership patterns largely continued in respect of the poverty and the brutality experienced by the majority of our people. So now, how do we ensure that when we talk about the fact that we must tighten belts, that we must do things differently, that the burden of that is spread across the entire society? Because the belt tightening is something that occurred to workers in the working class, whilst we see the Mercedeses and the flats in the center of the waterfront grow bigger every year. There's got to be some relativity between that if there is to be a meaningful engagement, and if we are to find a way to build the trust that's a key requirement to undo the huge deficit that exists. And of course, the political instability that we have at the moment, the corruption that we have within the society, that in many respects feeds that political instability so that we're unable to hold people to account, that is feeding into the mix of the discontent that exists. And people are using that to defend their own positions, and in many respects defend the fact that they, as leaders, have largely been responsible for not dealing with the issues. So what we have as a measure of success in our society is how the bureaucrats can dot the I's and cross the T's. The Auditor General doesn't look at how we've responded to urgent service delivery issues. He looks if there's administrative compliance, if you've done all of the procedures correctly, but it doesn't respond to measuring what happens to the people's interest. And so what we've got to do is to ensure that along with the budget, we're responding to growing the economy much faster than it's grown before, but in a way that's fundamentally different. We've had huge growth rates from 1996 to probably around 2006, when the country experienced a decent amount of growth. The difficulty that went along with that is that it was largely jobless growth, because that was the period over which unemployment increased, and we weren't able to respond to the challenges to the extent that was required. But at the same time, when you see the levels of inequality increase, it's clear that the wealth in the country is going to certain sectors of the community, and it's not the kind of inclusive growth that we've been promising people. We haven't seen us, through the development finance agencies, ensure that we defend the industrial base of the economy against cheaper imports, that we invest more in the areas of comparative advantage that we have, that beneficiation is a key area that the Department of Trade and Industry supports, and that they have the funding to do that. The cutting-edge technology that's coming about at the moment is probably in the area of battery development for electrical cars. The lithium batteries are way ahead of platinum batteries that we should be researching ourselves. Because if we want to make that a key feature of the growing economy and we're going to be adding value, we're not investing enough money in research and development, and we're not making sure that it's giving us the opportunity. Is there enough of the budget going into ensuring that with the introduction of the fourth industrial revolution, that the jobs that are going to be displaced are going to be taken up in other areas of the economy? So we're not aligning the budget and its expenditure patterns to what the key challenges are in the country at the moment and what are the obvious challenges coming about in future. And that's where the biggest difficulty for us in the budget is. It's never been used to speak to the challenges of the poorer people of the society. Always, for them, it would be a consequence if the middle classes and the upper classes in the society rose, and whatever is the spillover of that, and it raises their levels of income, then that would be a bonus. But that doesn't seem to be the key focus of what should be our consideration. Even on basic programs that we as a country can promote in matters like localization, some of the Municipal Finance Act provisions and the PFMA presents difficulties in companies and government institutions having set aside to ensure that those are South African-made products, that those can create South African jobs, and that we can in that way expand the number of workers in the country and expand the consumer base and drive economic growth ourselves. So those are for us the things that we've got to look at. In respect of fiscal policy, we think there is some space. We have made slight increases in the tax burden onto broader sections of the society, but clearly there's a lot more space to do that. We'd like to see a cut in taxes for the workers and greater taxes being introduced for the wealthy and the super wealthy in the country, so that there is more money available for dealing with the challenges that exist. Whether those money is used in infrastructure, we entirely agree, but the expenditure has got to be managed more effectively, because it's out of the fiscus that we've seen the hugest amount of corruptions taking place. Whether it's in the state-owned enterprises or other areas, there's been a whole-scale looting. So in many respects, there is money available to deal with the challenges that exist, but the funding and the execution of that money has just been hopefully mismanaged, and we're not able to deal with it effectively. Some of the numbers from government at the moment in respect of driving infrastructural, if I can then just conclude, in driving infrastructural investment is around R1 billion a day, around whether it's the programs around ESCOM or some of the others, the expenditure program around Transnet, and those are issues that we've got to look at. The final points that I want to make is around fiscal stimulus and whether it's required. We think we've got to avoid austerity measures. And for that, there's got to be an investment driven by government in infrastructure and in other areas. And in part, that is because we generally have low savings levels in South Africa, and there's low investment levels in South Africa. We haven't seen the kind of attraction of foreign direct investment that we require in South Africa. And we've also seen a situation of lowering global growth that's going to impact on our society. But finally, the point that's probably most telling for us is the question about the business sector not investing in the economy, not showing the confidence in the domestic economy. There's stories of R100 billion sitting on many of their books that's not being reinvested. Many of them have moved their primary listings abroad, and that's certainly not the way you send a sign to international investors that the economy is at the level where we should be dealing with that. Thank you, Chair.